Esio, Trot, Chapter 3. Mr. Hoppy waited 7 whole days before he made his next move. On the afternoon of the 7th day, when Mrs. Silver was at work, he lifted tortoise number 2 from the balcony below and brought it into his living room. Number 2 had weighed exactly 15 ounces. He must now find one that weighed exactly 17 ounces, 2 ounces more. From his enormous collection, he easily found a 17-ounce tortoise, and once again he made sure the tortoise shells matched in colour. Then he lowered tortoise number 3 onto Mrs. Silver's balcony. As you will have guessed by now, Mr. Hoppy's secret was a very simple one. If a creature grows slowly enough, very, very slowly indeed, then you'll never notice that it's grown at all, especially if you see it every day. It's the same with children. They're actually growing taller every week, but their mothers never notice it until they're grown out of their clothes. Slowly does it, Mr. Hoppy told himself. Don't hurry it along. So this is how things went over the next 8 weeks. In the beginning, Alfie weighed 13 ounces. End of the first week, tortoise number 2, 15 ounces. End of the second week, tortoise number 3, 17 ounces. End of the third week, tortoise number 4, 19 ounces. The fourth week, tortoise number 5, 21 ounces. The fifth week, tortoise number 6, 23 ounces. End of the sixth week, tortoise number 7, 25 ounces. And end of week 7, tortoise number 8, weighed in at 27 ounces. Alfie's weight was 13 ounces. Tortoise number 8 was 27 ounces. Very slowly, over 7 weeks, Mrs. Silver's pet had more than doubled in size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. Even to Mr. Hoppy, peering down over his railing, tortoise number 8 looked pretty big. It was amazing that Mrs. Silver had hardly noticed anything at all during the operation. Only once as she looked up and said, "You know, Mr. Hoppy, I do believe he's getting a bit bigger. What do you think?" "I can't see a lot of difference myself," Mr. Hoppy had answered casually. But now perhaps it was time to call a halt, and that evening Mr. Hoppy was just about to go out and suggest to Mrs. Silver that she ought to weigh Alfie when a startled cry came from over the balcony from below. "Look!" Mrs. Silver was shouting. "Alfie's too big to get through the door of his little house. He must have grown enormously." "Weigh him," Mr. Hoppy ordered. "Take him in and weigh him quick." Mrs. Silver did just that, and in half a minute she was back holding the tortoise in both hands and waving above her head and shouting, "Guess what? Mr. Hoppy, guess what? He weighs 27 ounces. He's twice as big as he was before." "Oh, you darling," she cried, stroking the tortoise. "Oh, you great big wonderful boy. Just look at what clever Mr. Hoppy has done for you." Mr. Hoppy suddenly felt very brave. "Mrs. Silver," he said, "do you think I could pop down to your balcony and hold Alfie myself?" "Why, of course you can, Mr. Silver," she cried. "Come down at once." Mr. Hoppy rushed down the stairs, and Mrs. Silver opened the door to him. Together they went out onto the balcony. "Just look at him," Mrs. Silver said proudly. "Isn't he grand?" "He's a big, good-sized tortoise now," Mr. Hoppy said. "And you did it," Mrs. Silver cried. "You're a miracle man. You are indeed." "But what am I going to do about his house?" Mrs. Silver said. "He must have a house to go in at night, but now he can't get through the door." They were standing on the balcony looking at the tortoise, who was trying to push his way into his house, but he was too big. "I shall have to enlarge the door," Mrs. Silver said. "Oh, don't do that," Mr. Hoppy said. "You mustn't go chopping up such a pretty little house. After all, he only needs to be just a tiny bit smaller, and he could get in easily." "How can he possibly get smaller?" Mrs. Silver asked. "That's simple," Mr. Hoppy said. "Change the magic words. Instead of telling him to get bigger and bigger, tell him to get a bit smaller. But in tortoise language, of course." "Will that work?" "Of course it'll work." "Tell me exactly what I have to say, Mr. Hoppy." Mr. Hoppy got out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote, "Esio, Trot, Esio, Trot. Teg a tip relambst, a tib relambs." "That'll do it," Mrs. Silver, he said, handing her the paper. I don't mind trying it, Mrs. Silver said, but look here, I wouldn't want him to get too titchy small, all over again, Mr. Hoppy. He won't, dear lady, he won't, Mr. Hoppy said. Say it only tonight and tomorrow morning, and then see what happens. We might be lucky. If it works, Mrs. Silver said, touching him softly on the arm, then you are the cleverest man alive. The next afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy lifted the tortoise up from her balcony and carried it inside. All he had to do now was to find one that was a shade smaller, so that it would just go through the door of the little house. He chose one and lowered it down with his tortoise catcher. Then, still gripping the tortoise, he tested it to see if it would go through the door. It wouldn't. He chose another. Again he tested it. This one went through nicely. Good. He placed the tortoise in the middle of the balcony beside a piece of lettuce and went inside to await Mrs. Silver's coming home. That evening Mr. Hoppy was watering his plants on the balcony when suddenly he heard Mrs. Silver's shouts from below, shrill with excitement. Mr. Hoppy, where are you? She was shouting, just look at this. Mr. Hoppy popped his head over the railing and said, what's up? Oh, Mr. Hoppy, it's worked. She was crying, your magic words have worked again. On Alfie, he can now go through the door of the little house. It's a miracle. Can I come down and look? Mr. Hoppy shouted back. Come down at once, my dear man, Mrs. Silver answered. Come down and see the wonders you worked upon my darling Alfie. Mr. Hoppy ran from the balcony into the living room, jumping on tiptoe like a ballet dancer between the sea of the tortoises that covered the floor. He flung open his front door and flew down the stairs 2 at a time, with the love songs of 1,000 cupids ringing in his ears. This is it, he whispered to himself, under his breath. The greatest moment of my life is coming up now. I mustn't bish it. I mustn't bosh it. I must keep very calm. When he was 3/4 of the way down the stairs, he caught sight of Mrs. Silver, already standing at the open door, waiting to welcome him with a huge smile on her face. She flung her arms around him and cried out, You really are the most wonderful man I've ever met. You can do anything. Come in at once and let me make you a cup of tea. That's the very least you deserve. Seated in a comfortable armchair in Mrs. Silver's parlour, sipping his tea, Mr. Hoppy was all of a twitter. He looked at the lovely lady sitting opposite him and smiled at her. She smiled right back at him. That smile of hers, so warm and friendly, suddenly gave him the courage he needed, and he said, Mrs. Silver, please will you marry me? Why, Mr. Hoppy, she cried, I didn't think you'd ever get round to asking me. Of course I'll marry you. Mr. Hoppy got rid of his cup of tea, and the two of them stood up and embraced warmly in the middle of the room. It's all due to Alfie, Mrs. Silver said, slightly breathless. Good old Alfie, Mr. Hoppy said, and we'll keep him forever. The next afternoon, Mr. Hoppy took all his other tortoises back to the pet shops and said they could have them for nothing, and he cleaned up his living room, leaving not a leaf of cabbage nor a trace of tortoise. A few weeks later, Mrs. Silver became Mrs. Hoppy, and the two of them lived happily ever after. P.S. I expect you're wondering what happened to little Alfie, the first of all of them. Well, he was bought a week later from one of the pet shops by a small girl called Roberta Squibb, and he settled down in Roberta's garden. Every day she fed him lettuce and tomato slices and crispy celery, and in the winters he hibernated in a box of dry leaves in the tool shed. That was a long time ago. Roberta has grown up now and is married and has 2 children of her own. She lives in another house, but Alfie is still with her. Still the much-loved family pet, and Roberta reckons that by now he must be about 30 years old. It has taken him all that time to grow to twice the size he was when Mrs. Silver had him, but he made it in the end. And I hope you enjoyed that story. Bye everyone.